Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm here to create another moral philosophy video. So if you've seen my moral nihilism video and my video on emotivism, you would know that I'm very much on the end of moral anti-realism. So to make a clear distinction between that and moral realism, the difference would simply be is that instead of believing that morals are an objective feature of the world, moral anti-realists would more so argue that moral claims and moral statements are not objective features of the world. Those that do believe that would be the moral realists. And I wanted to create this video because as a moral, anti-realist, I always sort of struggled talking about normative ethics, to be honest, because the difference between meta ethics and normative ethics is that normative ethics talks about what you should do morally, what actions should you take to be a moral person or whatever, yada, yada, yada. Meta ethics is more so talking about the nature in which good and bad exists or how we view morality itself rather than what we should do morally. So then again, you can see a lot of overlap in both of these topics, but I needed to make that distinction, fairly clear and obvious because as a moral anti-realist, and if a lot of you who are also moral anti-realists would, would happen to stumble, upon this video as well, I think a lot of you would agree with me that moral realists are not good at discussing normative ethics. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not good at discussing normative ethics either. In my honest point of view, I don't think anybody can actually tackle normative ethics properly, at least in terms of objectivity. I know that moral realists want to believe they can tackle normative ethics and, make clear distinctions on what people ought to do, how people ought to behave and treat each other. But here's the thing, that doesn't really make any sense. And the reason I used the word ought in particular is because there is no such thing as an ought in this world. And I'll explain what I mean by this. This is an idea by David Hume, which I think is a pretty good case against moral realism in general. He basically points out that you can't actually get an ought from an is because an is just a description, a, a way in which the world exists. And ought is more like a way in which the world, the universe, or whatever, ought to be, how it ought to come into place, behave, or yada, yada, yada. But I think what we learn when Hume raises this whole like is ought problem is that when it comes to morality, or maybe we can just say anything in general, humans apply a lot of projection into the world. You can't actually derive what is supposed to happen just from the way things are. And bringing this back over to morality, I'll make a case like this. Imagine a knife. It's a sharp blade, right? One might say, oh, you ought not to stab someone with it. You ought not to take anyone's life with it. Or, a knife is something that ought to belong in the kitchen because obviously within a lot of like culinary and like cooking and whatnot, it ought to be useful. But when you think of the state of the knife, what is the knife? It's just a knife. It's just a blade. It doesn't do anything. So there's less ought in the world more than what it can do. Someone can pick up a knife and, go over and just go on a stabbing spree and start killing people with it. Someone can pick up a knife and just start cutting food and, preparing themselves a meal. So, what does this mean about the knife itself morally? The knife itself has no objective moral feature about it. And if you take this and just apply it to like anything in general, humans always project what they're supposed to do with the thing that they think they're supposed to do. So, therefore, all of this is a projection. When I think of an ought statement, it's just, projection and whatnot. So when moral realists go around claiming that this is how we ought to be, that doesn't really make sense because I think if they were to be honest and if we were all to be honest, that's just something we can do. The actual nature in which it's good or bad, whatever you're condemning, oh, that's wrong, or whatever you're saying is, oh, pretty good. Oh, how nice of you to, donate to charity. It just exists in your mind. And if you go back to my video on emotivism, this is just, chemical wirings that allow such a thing because morality comes from emotions. We project our emotions onto the world. So therefore, it renders all ought statements as, completely, invalid. Now, another objection that I see a lot of moral realists do towards moral anti-realists such as myself, because they claim that we can't make any, obviously like normative prescriptions about like what we should do. I think, yeah, this is very much, a flawed thing to do because as I've already mentioned, we can behave in a certain way. There's no logical explanation why we ought to do that, but we can do that. So therefore, as a moral, you know, anti-realist myself, and I would just say that all moral statements are just either projections or prescriptive claims. It's prescriptive claims. You place it upon something. It is not a description of the thing itself. That's the difference between descriptivism and prescriptivism, pretty much, like basically in this way of like thinking. So essentially, a lot of moral realists will act as though, unless you have objective moral facts, you can't condemn or, condone something. But that doesn't really make any sense, though, because there's no objective feature in the world that, the laws of physics, whatever, blah, 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 and like things like that, that would enable something subjective to pass through. So even if we, at best, let's say, just subjectively thought that it's wrong to do, this certain act that a lot of people would, condone, we have the power to, enforce those consequences, even if, let's say, subjectively, like all of these people in prison right now, they don't objectively deserve to be there, but we can still subjectively make that happen. So the only difference here is basically the label. There is no like mystical force stopping us from just because, oh, if you, because to a lot of like moral like realists, they have like a sick allergic reaction to the word like subjective, I guess, or they have like a sick allergic reaction to like basically anything that alludes that like there are no objective like moral facts. But like they still don't really explain how just because we call these things subjective or we call these things like, oh, not an actual thing to stand on, if we engage in like fictionalism, they act as though it still cannot be something in which we run the world by, which we obviously do. And again, facts don't care about your feelings, right? So in the other way around, I think it would just be true that basically feelings don't care about facts. So there is nothing stopping me from imposing my morality, even if I can't, logically justify it. Like nothing at all. There's nothing stopping you from trying to impose your, morality, even if you can't objectively justify it. And it's all a matter of power dynamics, basically. If the ball's in your court, you have the privilege to not make sense. And I'm being completely honest about it. Nobody can justify their moral values at all because you're taking a huge leap in logic to say that just because murder, just because stealing is sure an objective feature of the world. I sort of see it as a yes, it's an equivocation. It's an equivocation fallacy, I guess, if I could like insert that there, because you're using different definitions in a way that it doesn't make sense for. So I think like another straw man that a lot of moral realists might take. I guess okay, perhaps maybe not all. Like if you're like intellectually honest, but I guess I'm just thinking about people that are like I don't know, maybe just getting into moral philosophy, and they see like, oh, how can morals not exist? Because obviously people clearly act in a way that morals exist. And again, it would be an equivocation fallacy on my part to think that they're saying that in the way that I'm saying it as a moral anti-realist. But like again, from like my point of view, like that's what I'm saying though. We act as though our, moral conclusions and our moral statements are, I don't know, some form of like objective facts. But it's like I will even admit, I think I've said it in my emotivism video most likely, or even my moral nihilism video, that like basically shame or like manipulation is all required in imposing moral you know moral ways of being, because obviously people are more easily to influence if they feel vulnerable, and one way for people to feel extremely vulnerable is if they feel extremely guilty. That's why people that are obviously like antisocial to others come off kind of like intimidating to other people, because they don't understand what their limitations are compared to most people that are already fine with the conformity of like a certain moral code or whatever. So yeah, to wrap this all up, you cannot get an ought from an is, because all an is does, if you ask me, is something that it can do. So back to an explanation about a knife. You can kill somebody with a knife. You can use a knife to cut food, or you can just leave it alone and, not do anything with it. So all these things that you can do are not the same as things that you have to do or that you ought to do. So again, this is kind of going like off topic, but like in a way, I think like the closest that I can explain things is that the only reason we do anything whatsoever is literally from like a deterministic lens with an illusion of choice, with an illusion of free will. But to give the practicality in terms of like the debate about like moral discussion, yes, there are no objective moral facts, and acting as though they are there, again, it's a feature of the universe to allow us to do that, but it's not a feature of the universe itself. So basically, that's a quick summarization of my moral anti-realist views. And to like yeah finish this whole video is why I think normative ethics in you know moral philosophy kind of fails. But again, I acknowledge there's going to be a lot of like overlap, exactly, or I think that's why I think that like yeah, if I'm just being honest, a lot of moral realists, when they're trying to discuss, moral, normative ethics, they're all just crooks. They're all just frauds. But yeah, share your thoughts with me if you disagree.